In June 2018, a disappearance case in Thailand captured the world's attention, prompting multiple countries to mobilize a total of 5,000 rescue personnel in a joint response. The incident began when a football coach from Chiang Rai and his 12 players went to explore the Tam Luang cave to celebrate one of the players' birthdays. But once they entered, the 13 people vanished without a trace. It wasn't until that night, when torrential rain began to pour from the sky, that the parents of the children realized something was wrong. They quickly drove around searching for them. After 4 hours, they finally spotted the children's abandoned bicycles at the cave entrance. However, no matter how much the parents called out, they received no response, because the Tam Luang cave was over 10,000 meters deep, and the range of sound transmission was extremely limited. Even more despairing was the fact that, due to the complex geological structure of the mountain, and the fact that the entire cave system had already been flooded, they could only wait for professional rescuers. At 12:47 a.m., the Navy SEALs stationed nearby arrived with a full truck of equipment to begin the rescue operation. The provincial governor also arrived at the scene upon receiving the news. Meanwhile, an avid cave enthusiast provided the rescue team with an internal map of the Tam Luang cave. Although the terrain inside was extremely narrow, there were fortunately several chambers large enough to accommodate people, which improved the children's chances of survival. Soon, the Navy SEALs, having fully geared up, entered the cave along the mapped route to begin their search, while simultaneously laying down brightly colored guide ropes in the water to prevent getting lost in the complex terrain. However, after more than 4 hours had passed, the search team had found nothing, and worse, one of the team members had been badly injured by a sharp rock, his head bleeding. A highly trained, well-equipped Navy diver had taken over 4 hours to advance only 800 meters, which showed just how difficult the rescue operation really was. By this point, the families were nearly in despair, fearing their children had already met a terrible fate. By the second day, the situation had escalated to national attention. Thai authorities mobilized over 100 government agencies, and volunteers also joined the rescue effort. They used water pumps to drain the water from inside the cave, but the results were like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. At this point, a water engineer from Bangkok suggested that to solve the flooding problem, they should first block the water inlets on the mountain. Otherwise, with the current rainfall during the monsoon season, the water inside the cave would only keep rising. However, these inlets couldn't simply be blocked with a few sandbags. The only viable solution was to divert the water, to channel the rainwater away and drain it downhill. But this would infringe on the interests of local farmers, because at the foot of the mountain lay hundreds of hectares of rice paddies, the farmers' entire year's livelihood. After learning about this, the governor immediately went to negotiate with the local farmers, explaining the plan to divert the water from the mountain.
แล้วมันจะช่วยละออนได้ก็เจ้า
จริงๆแล้วผมรับประกันอะไรไม่ได้ครับแต่ว่ามันเป็นการเพิ่มโอกาสรอดให้กับเด็กๆ
On one side were lives that had nothing to do with them. On the other was their family's only source of income. After discussing among themselves, the farmers ultimately chose to save lives. By the fifth day, the Tam Luang cave incident had further escalated, and the rescue operation had become an international effort. Responding to the Thai government's request for help, over 1,000 volunteers and rescue experts from around the world arrived at the scene. Among them were 2 British cave diving experts, Rick and John. Compared to the Navy SEALs, who trained in open water diving, the 2 Brits might not have had the physical advantage, but their professional skills were top-notch. Soon after arriving, they couldn't wait to put on their diving suits, and, following the guide ropes, made their way to Chamber 3, where intense water pumping operations were underway. This was also the farthest point reachable on foot. To go any further, they would have to submerge. They put on their fins, connected their oxygen tanks, and dove into the water. The conditions underwater were extremely treacherous, near zero visibility, razor-sharp stalactites and sudden undercurrents, so even these 2 experts with 30 years of cave diving experience had to proceed cautiously, following the guide ropes left by the previous SEAL team. They crawled through the narrow stalactite tunnels, where the terrain was so tight that one wrong move could get them stuck. After nearly 4 hours, they finally reached the T-junction 1,600 meters from the cave entrance, the farthest point the Navy SEALs had been able to explore. Continuing forward means there is no guidance from the rope, but the ample remaining oxygen in their tanks gave them the confidence to press on. But just then, water seeping through the mountain caused a rock wall to collapse, and a powerful surge of water rushed in. In the end, they decided to turn back the way they came and regroup. As they approached Chamber 3, they encountered a volunteer pump operator in distress. The rising water had cut off his return path. John gave up his equipment so Rick could take the volunteer out first. But for an ordinary person with no diving experience, nearly 100 meters of underwater travel felt like falling into a bottomless abyss. Fear caused the man to panic and struggle multiple times along the way, even knocking Rick's regulator out of his mouth. Fortunately, nearby staff were close at hand, so the terrified maintenance worker was able to evacuate safely. Rick then grabbed his gear, turned back immediately, and surfaced together with John, who had been waiting. But the moment they emerged from the water, the governor gave them a well-intentioned warning.
I must ask, please, do not go in the cave again without my permission.
The reason was simple. The governor didn't want foreign friends to risk their lives, because if an accident occurred, the resulting public backlash would be impossible to control. By the time the heavy rain had lasted for 7 days, the family's hearts had been filled with despair. They no longer held out hope that their children were alive. They only asked that the rescue team could recover their bodies. The next day, after discussions, the governor decided, for safety reasons, to wait for the rain to stop before deciding who would go in next. After 2 agonizing days of waiting, the long-awaited break in the rain finally arrived. On the other side of the cave entrance, after deliberation, the governor ultimately decided to let John and Rick go in first to search. After all, in terms of cave diving expertise, they were among the best in the world. On the 10th day, the two suited up and entered the cave immediately. It took them 3 hours and 50 minutes to reach the T-junction again. They attached a new rope to the end of the guideline, in case they lost their way on the return. Then they continued searching further. Their bodies navigated through narrow tunnels, relying only on limited light sources to find their way forward. Just as the rope coil in their hands was about to run out, they successfully passed through the tunnel and arrived at chamber 9. Suddenly, Rick smelled a pungent odor. Following the smell, they searched until they finally spotted a glimmer of hope on the shore. Faint, but incredibly bright. Rick could hardly believe his eyes. The missing 13 boys were standing right before him, alive and well. All of this was thanks to their coach, who had taught the team to resist hunger through meditation, face fear through unity, and encourage one another. They had survived 10 days against all odds, but due to a lack of manpower, the children couldn't be rescued yet. All the two could do was provide them with 2 new flashlights, and hurry back to plan their next move. They set out from chamber 9, 2,500 meters from the entrance, and it took them 6 hours and 12 minutes to return. As they transmitted the video confirming that all the children were safe, Rick warned the SEALs not to spread the news that they were still alive. But the next second, the team members couldn't hold back their cheers. In no time, all the staff in the cave had seen the footage of the children alive and well. Soon, the families and media outside the cave also received the news. It was an exhilarating miracle. But compared to the family's tears of joy, Rick and John felt the opposite, because they knew all too well that getting the children out of the flooded cave was far harder than finding them. The volunteer from earlier had only traveled 800 meters and had nearly broken down multiple times along the way. How could these untrained children possibly follow them through 2,500 meters of underwater tunnels? Though they had no perfect solution yet, the immediate priority was to deliver supplies to the 13 starving people. Since the Navy SEALs had only reached the T-junction, Rick had to brief them on the rest of the route and the precautions. He told them how to adjust their posture through the tight tunnels, and how to manage their oxygen consumption. He stressed that after delivering the supplies, they must keep at least 2/3 of their oxygen, because the return trip would be far more physically demanding. Soon, the SEALs geared up and set out. After 7.5 hours of diving, they finally reached chamber 9, 2,500 meters in, delivering essential food and batteries to the children. However, the team leader suddenly noticed that their remaining oxygen was only enough for one of them to return. Clearly, they hadn't heeded Rick's earlier warning. Even worse, the oxygen level inside the cave had already dropped below 20%, putting everyone at risk of suffocation at any moment, and the number of trapped people had now increased from 13 to 15. When the last SEAL finally struggled out of the cave, he was completely exhausted. Seeing the children still stranded, the families gathered anxiously in front of the governor's office. Though the governor himself had no answers, he steeled himself and made a promise that the children would come home safely. This reassured the families, but the difficulty behind that promise could perhaps only be understood by those truly involved in the rescue. Everyone was at a loss, until a bold, almost crazy idea struck Rick. They contacted every expert capable of assisting, including an anesthesiologist named Harry, who would be the key to the entire rescue plan. When Harry arrived, Rick and John laid out the plan to him. They wanted to sedate the children and transport them out like cargo, but Harry immediately rejected the idea. A sedated person required constant monitoring, otherwise, they could easily choke on their own saliva. And if a sedated person woke up mid-transport, they would almost certainly panic and struggle. This method gave the children less than a 20% chance of survival. Harry was unwilling to take that risk. But the next day, something happened that changed his mind. A Navy SEAL, while delivering supplies to the children, had his oxygen tank trapped in a rock crevice. In his struggle to free it, a massive amount of oxygen leaked out. The sudden accident gave him no time to react, and just like that, a young life was forever swallowed by the silent, dark water. By now, the oxygen level inside the cave was critically low. All 15 trapped individuals were in constant danger, and in subsequent supply deliveries, more casualties might occur. This made Harry realize that the rescue operation had reached a desperate point, and at this moment, the anesthesia plan seemed to be the only viable option. They presented the plan and its risks to the governor. Though the survival rate was only 20%, it was the only feasible solution. After reporting upward, the governor approved the plan.
Do your best. And if we fail, the failure is mine alone.
The rescue plan was kept strictly confidential because if it leaked, they would be condemned by the entire society. Harry trained all participants in the injection procedure, requiring them to administer a sedative to the children every 30 minutes. Otherwise, the children risked waking up midway. That very day, they launched the rescue. After 9 hours of diving, they reached the children's location, but they could only take 4 at a time. After the children lost consciousness, the rescuers put oxygen masks on them, bound their hands and feet, and placed them underwater to check their breathing. Once confirmed, the rescue operation began. Because this method had never been attempted in history, Rick and the others were extremely nervous. After sending off the first child, they began preparing the next. At first, everything went smoothly, but halfway through, the first child's sedative began to wear off, and his limbs started twitching involuntarily. Fortunately, the rescuer quickly administered another dose. Meanwhile, the child John was transporting suddenly stopped breathing mid-journey. John immediately removed his mask, and the child began breathing again. In the end, the first rescue mission was completed without major incident. All 4 children were safe, and airlifted to a local hospital. When Harry learned from the doctors that all the children were out of danger, he let out a long sigh of relief. When an idea is proven viable in action, it brings a unique sense of relief and joy. However, this only increased the pressure on John and Rick. If only one child had survived, given the difficulty of the rescue, the families wouldn't have blamed them. But now that they had successfully saved 4, if anything went wrong in the next phase, they would be remembered as villains. On the 17th day of the rescue, with the experience from the first attempt, that day's operation went especially smoothly. 5 more boys were safely escorted out. But just as everyone was cheering, dark clouds gathered on the distant horizon. That night, the rain came pouring down again. Needless to say, this added to the difficulty of the third day's mission. Because of water seeping through the mountain, the cave entrance that had been pumped dry was once again flooded up to knee level. Undoubtedly, conditions inside the cave were even more dangerous, but they had no time to wait for the rain to stop. That day, they decided to evacuate all remaining trapped individuals, though the strong currents made the rescue harder. Fortunately, the operation went relatively smoothly, except for one less experienced rescuer, who, caught off guard by a sudden undercurrent, was swept away from the guide rope in the chaos. Luckily, in desperation, he felt for the electrical cables previously laid by the Navy SEALs, managed to steady himself, and continued forward. He eventually reached Chamber 4, safe but shaken. However, the sedative schedule had been thrown off. To ensure the boys' safety, he had to wait on the shore for help. Eventually, Harry found them on his way back, and successfully completed the rescue. In the end, all 13 people were rescued alive after being trapped in the cave for 17 days. The water in the Tam Luang cave didn't fully drain until 8 months after their rescue. The affected farmers also received appropriate compensation. During this rescue operation, 2 Navy SEALs lost their lives, one due to oxygen leakage, and the other from a blood infection sustained during the rescue. This is a true story. Some gave their professional expertise, some made selfless sacrifices without asking for anything in return, and some charged forward at the risk of their own lives. They crossed skin colors and nationalities, for the sole purpose of saving every single life.